So I guess on this sort of academic track, I'm wondering about the courses that you teach within this Canadian Jewish Studies mold.
Yes. So they follow to an extent from my own training. So I tend to teach literary courses. If they had hired a historian, they would get much more constantly historical courses. So I most often teach a Canadian Jewish literature course, which otherwise would not be being taught at Concordia, which I think is kind of startling in a city like Montreal. And I'm a guy from Calgary via Vancouver, via Toronto and New Brunswick, working my way around to Montreal. So it's not as if I'm a Montrealer who's there to sell Montreal, but I mean, it's a city where that literature should be taught. And I do Holocaust literature very often because it's my field, but it's also a very popular subject, and it's one that I find very great variety in the student body. So it's moving out into the university community in nice ways. And then they let me do upper level courses, which will focus on Jewish identity, maybe in a more cultural studies way, so that we can look at different media, so sometimes film and music. And these will not always have a only Canadian focus, but they do always include a good portion of it. And this coming term I'm doing for the first time a course on the role of autobiography in Jewish culture, and the students will also do some creative writing. So that's the first time that I've been able to link my writing work with my scholarly work.
Okay. And I understand that the Institute is kind of housed or associated with the Religious Studies department, and as you said, you're a literature specialist. I'm wondering if kind of being under this Religious Studies rubric changes the way that you teach or constrains you in any way.
That's interesting. I mean, increasingly the courses are cross-listed with the English department at Concordia, so I will get sometimes 50% English and then a whole mix of others, including religion. So it kind of goes course by course. You figure out who you've got in front of you, and then you have to remember how those students are used to being taught and what is safe and successful to try to create something that will kind of bridge their interests. But I would say that my department overall is a very kind of open and collegial department, and when they hired me, they got what they were getting. So there hasn't really been any effort to try to say, well, you're not doing all these canonical or sort of more disciplinary things that we might expect, because they just know that my discipline, though Jewish studies crosses over with a number of people in the department, my way of coming to it is so focused on literature and culture more broadly.
And I guess maybe coming from a literature standpoint, you see the way that all the disciplines are actually very fluid, and does that maybe help the students sort of figure that out as well?
Well, it's forced me for sure. So I have had to retool to a pretty good extent. So especially in the early years at Concordia, and when this institute and the courses that it sort of housed were being promoted, there was a need to make the discipline increasingly broad. So I would think about a course that would introduce Canadian Jewish studies, which couldn't be all literature because that would be nonsense. So I had to retool for sure. And then you over a period of years, you just somehow you find balances that don't work, and then you sort of reorganize and then try to find balances that do.
Now, moving on to the special issue on Richler. I understand at one point you intended this as a book on Richler, and I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit the history about this.
Yeah, it's curious. And we should say a little bit about my co-editor of this volume. That's Natalie Cook, who's in the English department at McGill. And she's a Canadian literature specialist, and in particular, I think Margaret Atwood was a focus for her. She's now an associate dean. And she's had sort of to some extent, entrepreneurial role to play at McGill. And one of the things that she did was a conference called the Richler Challenge, which was very substantial, involved a lot of major people from all around the country, had the backing to some extent of Richler's family, and she brought in the press in a very substantial way, so that much of the conference appeared on Bravo, I think. So unusual for an academic conference. So what she caught was kind of an early stage at which his reputation after his death was sort of undergoing a kind of a rethinking. And there was a pretty, appreciative air in the room, but also a willingness to try to figure out where he was headed in terms of his reputation, and in what way, the displeasure that he'd caused in Quebec was changing or not changing. So the outcome of that was that she wanted to do a book, but it didn't happen for reasons that I don't know. I wasn't involved, but she had some material left from that conference, got in touch with me, and then we actually kind of rethought the whole thing. And sometimes when you look back at this, you sort of wonder, why did we do that? And I don't exactly remember, but we just blew the thing up very large, and it must have been in part because of the success of the conference, her motivation, both of our feeling that the timing was good, that there was increased interest in Richler. So we started to gather a lot more academic work, but then we also pushed further out, and we went with a guy who does walking tours, had a photographer come with us, so we got an oral walking tour with photography. We did a couple of interviews, one with young French writer and translator who were newly interested in Richler, first generation of Quebec writers, French language people interested. Did an interview with a guy who had scripted a couple of Richler stories for film. And then what we had created after all of that was quite an, I would say, unwieldy package, although I still thought it would have made maybe not an academic book, but I kind of thought a trade book. It had that more open kind of feel to it. But in the end, I think what we created was something that was a challenge to find a venue for. And it was fortunate that I still had contact with people here like Glenn Deere, and I didn't know Marjorie, your editor, prior to doing this, but they very quickly, and so it reflects, I guess, the way a journal can be fast on its feet. They took a look at the sort of the variety of the material, the academic stuff. Oh yeah, that makes a volume. The more popular stuff, the photography and the walking tour, and that can go on our website. So I think that the success of that came from Canadian literature's kind of fast editorial thinking. And you might say they saved the project, because if not for this kind of a mixed outcome where you have print and then other stuff online, a whole lot of it would have probably gone to waste. And that's not because it wasn't good. It just kind of, it had a bit of a idiosyncratic fit when we looked at it all together.
So you've managed to use all of the material?
Almost everything. I mean, when they took a look at the essays that we had for the substantial scholarly collection, the people that vetted it didn't agree that everything there needed to go in, and so they didn't all go in. But I thought that was fine. I mean, you go get these readers, and they actually ended up with, on the whole, quite young writers, and you could say new to Richler scholars. So the stuff that you have in the journal itself is really very fresh in that way. It's not, we didn't go ask if there are any heavy hitters to do some summation or do some new take on the work they'd already done. It all ended up being a new generation of people, and that seems to be maybe who the readers for the journal were drawn to.
And you do end up going in some pretty interesting directions in this issue, not the expected directions.
Sure. Yeah. Stuff on pop culture, so Richler's fascination with comic books, and you've mentioned Melina Baumsinger's essay on really issues that you think about in other communities, race and diaspora, as how those terms can be related now to the way we think about Jewish literature.
And just as an aside, I wanted to mention that you actually have a history with Canadian literature as well.
Well, that was fun. Because when I was an undergrad, I was a work-study guy, and that meant a prof found, a few $1,000 for me. I guess. I don't really remember how much they ended up paying in those days. So I helped. In those days, we stripped up the pages, which makes me seem old, but that had to do with taping the film. I think that's what we were up to. Scotch tape, and also stripping up stuff like that. And then off it went to be photographed by the printer. So there was a certain amount of that done in-house when your offices were at Ponderosa. At the back of the campus.
My time.
And then also fact-checking. So it was fun. You'd go over to the office, and Bill knew who was the editor, would have a set, and you'd go off to main library, and it was very low-tech and very satisfying.
So kind of an interesting return for you personally.
Yeah.
Now, just going back to the impetus behind the project, and as you say, Richler's recent death, I guess, maybe stirred up a little bit. But in your mind, why Richler? Why now? Why is this relevant?
Well, that's a very complicated story, and I don't know if I don't have time to tell all of it. But if you know writers, you know that writing lives go in very unpredictable ways, and a lot of that has to do with luck, and it has to do with backers, and it has to do with canon. And I would say that Richler had a few things going for him. One was, towards the end of his life, his reception had really shifted. So he'd always bugged people, but people read him. So, he had a good thing going. That was good. Then, towards the end of his life, he wasn't bugging people anymore. And especially Barney's version, people tended to fall in love with him over that book. And other things, I guess he was older, he had a couple of bouts with illness, he wasn't quite as curmudgeonly and as embroiled in things as he had been. So his reception had kind of shifted. And then he was clearly, before his death, and of course after, top of the canon. So when he died, you had a kind of a Canadian icon. Not too many writers can be there when they go out, and then have whatever happens afterwards. So you have this Canadian icon with people who had invested in him, and it took a while. There was there was a quiet period, but eventually people clearly wanted to maintain that icon. And it would have to do with people in the publishing industry. It would have to do with his family, who have a certain amount of influence. It wasn't critics. So this is not a case where critics constantly teach, constantly write about, constantly puff up a writer. So this is sort of an interesting aspect of his post-death reception. It hasn't been a university-based or a scholarly thing. It's been really a popular, broader-based thing. Is it to some extent our need in Canada to hold on to, the few culture heroes that we have? Increasingly, we have more, but maybe the feeling was, we can't lose this guy. He's so, in some ways, unique and rich and specific to his time and place. It says something about Montreal, but my feeling, being a non-Montrealer, is that stuff just doesn't mean a thing out here, because if you live in Vancouver or Calgary, do you really care? I don't know. I don't think so, but I think it has to do with the way he was able to, it's this fascinating time and place, regardless, Montreal or not. He brought it across, with very great verve and humor, and that's what people in a very different place still want to hold on to.